I've been asked 100 times what it felt like to stand inside one. People imagine something mystical, a vibration in the chest, a light, a voice from nowhere. What they don't picture is the smell. Freshly broken wheat stalks smell green and slightly sweet, the way a stem does when you snap it between your fingers in a garden. It is one of the most ordinary smells in the world. I remember standing in the middle of 600 feet of perfect geometry, the chalk plain stretching out in every direction under a colorless August sky, and thinking, it smells like a salad. That was the moment I understood we were going to be all right. Whatever they were not here to terrify us. They were here to talk. Terrifying part. The part that took me 9 years and one very long summer to fully reckon with, is that we almost never answered. My name is irrelevant. What I was, professionally, was a data systems analyst with a background in computational geometry who took a 3-week holiday in Wiltshire in 2019 and never really left. I'd read the literature before I came. I was not a believer in the supernatural sense. I was, if anything, aggressively skeptical. The kind of man who annotates sources in margins, loses sleep over sample size problems, and has been known to send colleagues 3-paragraph emails about the misapplication of correlation statistics. What I believed in was data. And what the data said, once you stripped away the obvious hoaxes and the wishful thinking and the self-promoters who had been muddying the field for 30 years, was that something was happening in these fields that had no satisfactory explanation. That is not a mystical statement. That is a statement about the limits of current models. And the limits of current models are, in my experience, exactly where the work is, where the interesting work is. The work that no one is willing to do because the career risk is too obvious and the institutional support is non-existent. And the most likely outcome is that you spend years documenting something that turns out to have a mundane explanation, and you never quite recover professionally. That is the work I chose. The chalk country around Avebury is not dramatic in the tourist sense. It does not have the jagged grandeur of highland geography or the cinematic sweep of a coastal cliff. It is low, rolling, and very old. Fields are wide and quiet, and in summer they turn the color of old straw, and the hills are so gentle you can walk for an hour before you realize you've climbed several hundred feet. The light is different here than in other parts of England. Something about the chalk below the thin soil reflects it back up in a way that makes the landscape look slightly overexposed, even on overcast days, as though it is lit from both above and below. Silbury Hill sits on the plain, like a question no one has answered in 5,000 years. The largest prehistoric mound in Europe, its purpose still unknown, its geometry precise to a degree that surprises every surveyor who measures it fresh. The volume of chalk in it is calculated at 248,000 cubic meters. The base is perfectly circular. It was built in stages, revised and extended across generations, and whoever built it left no inscription, no burial, no obvious reason for its existence beyond the fact of the thing itself. A massive, deliberate mark left in a landscape by people who clearly felt that the landscape required marking. Avebury itself is a stone circle so large that an entire village was built inside it. The medieval inhabitants apparently indifferent to, or perhaps simply accustomed to the ring of ancient megaliths surrounding their homes. I used to think that was peculiar, the village inside the monument. I've come to think it was entirely rational. If something enormous and unexplained has always been there, you stop being startled by it, and you start treating it as part of the furniture. The useful question is not, why aren't they frightened, but what do they know that makes the thing familiar? This is the country where the formations came most frequently. This is where I went. I catalogued. That was my contribution in those early years. I was not a researcher with a theory to prove. I was a man with a database, a GPS unit, a measuring tape, and a camera with a drone attachment that cost more than my car, and that I'd bought with money I told myself I was borrowing from my pension. I recorded 6,241 formations over 9 years. Their dimensions, their locations, their geometric properties. The condition of the stems at the floor of Avebury, the dates of their appearance, relative to weather patterns and agricultural calendars and lunar cycles. I made notes on soil composition. I took magnetometer readings in and around each formation and at control points outside them, collected samples, stems, soil, seeds, and sent them to a laboratory in Exeter that processed environmental samples without asking too many questions about provenance, and whose results over 9 years showed me things that the scientific literature acknowledged but that the wider world had, for reasons that are not difficult to understand, declined to integrate into its picture of reality. I interviewed 340 farmers. Most of them were annoyed. They had formations appear in their fields, and the formations attracted tourists who damaged fences and dropped litter, and occasionally got into shouting matches with other tourists over the correct way to interpret a pictogram in barley. The farmers wanted the formations to stop. They mostly did not want to talk about what they had seen or heard on the nights the formations appeared. But over time, with persistence and genuine interest, and the occasional bottle of decent whiskey, some of them did. What they described was consistent across farms, across years, across the span of the entire documented history of the phenomenon. Lights, a low sound that was not quite a sound, more a pressure than a noise, felt in the chest and behind the eyes rather than heard with the ears, and the crops going down in that particular motion. Controlled, gradual, precise, that I would eventually see for myself. I interviewed 120 of self-described researchers of varying quality. Some were careful people doing genuine field work who had been dismissed by the scientific establishment and were, as a result, angry and increasingly prone to overreaching their evidence. Some were people whose connection to reality was, to put it charitably, flexible, and who saw the formations as confirmation of an elaborate worldview that the formations were doing very hard work to support. Some were somewhere in the middle, people who had seen something real, knew it was real, and had spent years trying to find language for it in a world that provided very little useful vocabulary. I listened to all of them. I took notes on all of them. I was careful not to let the worst of them poison my assessment of the phenomenon, and careful not to let the best of them pull me toward their particular interpretations before I had enough data of my own to form one. I interviewed 23 local government officials, most of whom wanted to talk about parking and agricultural damage, and the burden on the county's road infrastructure during the summer season. I interviewed 8 military liaison officers stationed at the facilities on Salisbury Plain to the south, all of whom stonewalled me with a professional courtesy that told me, more clearly than any disclosure would have, that they were not stonewalling because they had nothing to say. And I spent an afternoon in the kitchen of a very old woman in a village near Marlborough who had been watching the fields since the 1970s, and who told me, over a cup of tea that was mostly milk, and which she poured from a pot that had clearly been on the stove for at least 3 hours, that the circles were old, and that the people asking about them were the new thing. I asked her what she meant. She looked at me with the particular patience of someone who has answered this question many times and given up expecting the questioner to understand. The land knows, she said. The circles are talking to the land. People think you're in the conversation. Then she poured me more tea and changed the subject to her grandson's new job in Bristol, and I understood that I was not going to get more than that. I held all of it loosely. I had hypotheses and I revised them regularly. By 2026, I had ruled out wind vortices on structural grounds. The mathematics of what a plasma vortex can produce simply does not accommodate formations displaying the Fibonacci sequence at fractal scales, or the Mandelbrot set rendered in 409 individual circles across 780 feet of standing crop, or the precise phi ratio geometry of the Julia set that appeared opposite Stonehenge in 1996, and which a pilot flying over it, entirely by accident, photographed from the air. A formation that witnesses confirmed had not existed 90 minutes before he flew over it, appearing in broad daylight, in a field adjacent to a road with continuous traffic. I had ruled out conventional hoaxing for the substantial subset of formations that showed stem node elongation, consistent with exposure to microwave frequency energy, rather than mechanical compression. Stems that were bent but not broken, the node joints heated and stretched from the inside, in a way that no known human technique replicates at scale in the time windows available. For these formations, the soil showed anomalous deposits of magnetic particles. The seeds recovered showed measurably elevated, germination rates in controlled trials, and the geometry was, in every case I measured, accurate to tolerances that would challenge a well-equipped engineering firm working in daylight with modern tools. The data was the data. I did not have to believe in anything to read it. What the data said, in aggregate and without interpretation, was this. Something was producing geometrically perfect, mathematically sophisticated, physically anomalous formations in agricultural fields, with a concentration in the chalk country of southwest England, and this production had persisted for decades, was increasing in complexity, and was not explained by any mechanism current science had on offer. That is a data statement. It requires no leap of faith. It was simply what the measurements showed, when you looked at enough of them, carefully enough. The question I had not asked for 9 years was the question that was actually important. The question was not what produces the formations. The question was what the formations are for. The night the formation came down around me, I was alone in a barley field near the village of Alton Barnes at 11:30 in the evening. I was there because I had developed a theory about the correlation between formation site selection and the angle of the magnetic anomaly in the underlying chalk bedrock, and I wanted to take magnetometer readings at a series of grid points I had mapped out in daylight. The field had been empty when I'd walked it at 4 o'clock. It was a field I knew well. I had documented 3 formations in it over 6 years. It had a slight rise to the north that gave you a view, on clear nights, of a section of sky above the Pusey Vale, and the Milky Way was out that night in the way it only gets in these latitudes, when the humidity drops and the farms to the east have their lights off. I remember looking up at it and thinking that it was very beautiful, and that I spent too much time with my eyes at instrument level, and not enough time looking at things that were simply large. Then the barley began to lay down. There is no other way to describe it. The crop simply fell, blown. There was essentially no wind, and a wind strong enough to flatten barley would have been audible and would not have produced a precise geometry. Not trampled. I was standing and the nearest field boundary was a quarter-mile away, and nothing approached me. The crop fell in a motion that was almost hydraulic, smooth, gradual, and perfectly controlled, radiating outward from a center point, approximately 30 feet from where I was standing. The motion was not random. It was not chaotic. It was organized in exactly the way that the formations I had spent 9 years measuring were organized, from the center outward, in a spiral pattern, with each successive ring completing before the next began. There was a sound, not the crack of breaking stems. I cannot overstate how careful this point is, because mechanical compression of crop stems at this scale would produce a very audible sequence of breaks and snaps. What I heard was a compression sound, low and resonant, like the air being gently but firmly pressed out of an enclosed space. It was more felt than heard. It registered in the chest before the ears. It lasted for the duration of the formation's appearance. I stood absolutely still. I am told I should have run, and I understand the instinct behind that advice, and I cannot fully explain why I didn't follow it. What I can tell you is that the motion of the falling crop was so clearly deliberate, so obviously controlled, that it did not trigger anything I would describe as a threat response. There was no sense of aggression in it. There was no sense of randomness, precision of it, and in my years of field research, precision had become a kind of signature, a marker of intent, was not compatible, in any framework I had for understanding the world, with danger. Precision is not what danger looks like. Precision is what intelligence looks like, and intelligence, even intelligence I could not yet comprehend, does not frighten me the way randomness does. So I stood still, I watched, I let it happen. The formation took 4 minutes and 11 seconds. I know this because I had the presence of mind, somewhere in the first 30 seconds, to pull my phone from my shirt pocket and start the timer. The drone was on the ground beside me, and I powered it up, but it wouldn't lift. Some interference with the motor controllers, probably electromagnetic, that I had seen in documented cases before, but never experienced directly. So I stood in the center of what was forming around me, and I watched it with my own eyes. And I have thought since that this may have been exactly the right way to receive it, not through a lens or an instrument, just standing there with my boots in the barley stubble and the stars overhead, and the chalk plain, extending in every direction in the dark. The formation was, when I measured it at first light the following morning, 622 feet in diameter at its widest point. The stems around me were laid in a counterclockwise spiral of extraordinary precision. I took reference measurements at 40 points, and the deviation from perfect spiral geometry was, in no case, more than a few millimeters. The formation itself was a nested set of geometric shapes. A large outer circle, inside it a series of rings at intervals. Inside those a set of smaller circles arranged at positions on the inner ring, and connecting elements that I recognized, at first measurement, as construction lines. The geometric equivalent of the working marks that a draftsman leaves when constructing a complex shape from first principles. They were not decoration. They were method. They were showing, in the geometry itself, how the geometry had been made. At every measurable dimension, the ratio was phi, the golden ratio, 1.618, repeating through the structure at every scale from the width of the stem standing elements to the diameter ratios of the nested circles, to the angular intervals between the satellite formations. I knew the number. I had seen it in every major formation I had ever catalogued so often that I had stopped noting it as significant and had begun treating it as a baseline parameter. The way you might treat gravity as a baseline parameter in a mechanics problem. It was always there. I had never asked why it was always there. It occurred to me, standing in the pre-dawn light with my measuring tape and my notebook, and the formation spread around me in all directions, that this was a significant oversight. The consistent presence of phi across thousands of formations over decades was not a background condition. It was a signal. It was the signature. It was the thing the maker put on everything it made, the same way a craftsman leaves the marks of their particular tools. I sat down on the laid barley. I looked at the sky, which was just beginning to go from black to the very dark blue that precedes a Wiltshire August dawn, and I said out loud to no one I could see, "All right, I'm listening." Nothing answered, but I had not expected it to. I had expected nothing. What I had not expected was what I felt, sitting there, which was not fear and not awe exactly, though awe was part of it. What I felt was something closer to recognition, the sensation of a problem that has been sitting at the back of your mind, half-formed, finally arriving in a form you can hold and examine. 9 years of data, arriving at a single conclusion that I had been rotating around without being able to state directly. They were talking. They had been talking for decades. The question was not what they were saying. Question was whether anyone was going to say anything back. I went back to my car at sunrise. I drove to my rented cottage in Avebury. I made tea. I sat at the kitchen table, and I opened my laptop, and I looked at 6,241 records, and I tried to see them the way you would see them if someone had just confirmed that they were not phenomena to be explained, but communications to be answered. The difference is not trivial, and it is not semantic. A phenomenon is something that happens to you, which you record and analyze, and eventually explain. A communications is something directed at you, which carries intent, which exists because something wanted it to exist, and which calls for a response. If these were communications, and I was now sitting in my kitchen with the sunrise coming through the window and the tea going cold in my hand, prepared to operate on the assumption that they were, then 9 years of careful documentation had produced exactly the wrong output. I had been collecting the messages. I had not been writing back. The first thing I noticed, looking at the data with this reframing, was that the formations were not random in location. I had always known they clustered near ancient sites: Avebury, Silbury Hill, the West Kennet, Longbarrow, the Chalk Hill figures, the Rollright stones on the Oxfordshire border. I had recorded this as a correlation without a satisfying mechanism and had moved on, the way you do when a correlation doesn't fit any of your current hypotheses, and you don't want to reach for an explanation that your data doesn't support. Looking at it now as communication strategy rather than geophysical phenomenon, a different interpretation presented itself with a clarity that made me feel slightly foolish for not having seen it before. Whoever was producing these formations had chosen deliberately to produce them in places that we had already marked as significant. They had found the locations we had already identified as important. The places where our oldest ancestors had built the most deliberate structures. The sites that every culture to inhabit these islands for 5,000 years had treated as worth marking, and they had made their marks near our marks. This is not the behavior of something indifferent to us. It is the behavior of something that has been watching us long enough to know where we put our monuments, and that is choosing to speak in those places specifically because it knows we look there. They were leaving messages where we had left monuments. They were talking in our library. The second thing I noticed was sequencing, taken in strict chronological order. Not the order of documentation, but the actual order of appearance, reconstructed from the historical record, going back to the late 1970s. The formations that my analysis classified as anomalous, the non-hoaxed subset, showed a progression that I had never been able to see before, because I had never been looking for it. The early formations were simple, circles, then circles with attached rings, then circles with satellite formations, then pictograms that resembled no known alphabet but that had internal consistency. Elements that recurred in different formations, combined differently, elaborated differently, in what I can only describe as a developing grammar, then mathematical structures, then fractals, then structures encoding specific mathematical constants, then, in the last several years, formations that I had classified in my own records as unknown geometric function, because I did not have the vocabulary to name what they were doing. Formations that my colleagues in mathematics who had looked at them in confidence described as depicting structures that should not be possible within our current framework of geometry, and who had no good explanation for this. It was not random. It was not cyclical. It was a curriculum. The simple forms were the foundation, each stage built on what had been established before. Each stage added precision, complexity, mathematical depth. Progression was exactly what you would expect if something were learning to communicate in a medium it had not used before. They were teaching themselves to speak in crop, in the same way that someone learning a new language begins with simple nouns and works upward through grammar, toward idiom, and finally toward the things that are most difficult to express. The things that require a full command of the language to say it all. The question was where they were in that progression now, and the answer, looking at the most recent formations, was that they were considerably further along than I had recognized. I sat at that table for 6 hours. I missed breakfast, I missed lunch. The light in the kitchen changed from morning to afternoon while I worked. Finally looked up from the screen and looked at the window. The sun was low enough to be making shadows, and I had the outline of a theory that was either the most important thing a human being had ever worked out or the most elaborate self-delusion I had ever constructed. And I had no way, sitting there, to determine which. The only way to determine which was to test it. I went back to the field the next morning at dawn before the light was fully up. I brought 2 things, my measuring equipment, which I always brought, and a stick. A wooden stake, about 4 feet long, that I'd found leaning against the wall of the cottage, and which I had no particular use for beyond what I was about to do with it. I found a patch of flat ground at the field's edge, just outside the boundary of the formation from 2 nights before. The soil was soft enough to mark. I crouched down, took the stake and drew a circle. Just a circle. Crude and imperfect. I am not an artist. And the curve wavered, and the closing point didn't quite match the starting point, and the diameter was eyeballed rather than measured. Maybe 8 feet across, the kind of circle a child draws. Then I smoothed over any marks that might have indicated I'd spent more time on it than I had, so that the rough quality of the circle was the most honest representation of what I had. Then I walked away. I drove back to the cottage. I slept for 4 hours, which was more than I'd managed in 2 days. Ate a piece of toast. I drove back. There was a formation in the field, not in the flat ground where I'd drawn the circle. The formation was in the barley itself, as all the formations were. It was 200 feet across. It was a perfect circle, with a smaller concentric circle inside it, connected to the outer circle by a thin ring at a specific radius, and it set a single point on the outer circumference, a short straight line that bisected the curve at a precise right angle. I stood at the edge of it for several minutes before I understood what I was looking at. The formation was a response. It was not just a response to my circle. It was a correction of my circle. My imperfect curve had been received, and the response was a perfect version of what I had been trying to make. And the addition, the bisecting line at the circumference, was something I recognized immediately because I had studied geometry carefully and I knew my Euclidean constructions. It was a construction line. It was the first step in constructing a perfect circle from a point and a given radius. It was pedagogical. They were not just acknowledging that I had drawn a circle. They were showing me how to draw a better one. I sat down on the grass at the field's edge. My hands were shaking slightly, which I noticed with a detached interest. I sat there until the shaking stopped, which took about 10 minutes. Then I went back to my flat ground and drew again. The exchange that followed over the next 7 weeks was the most important and the strangest experience of my professional life. And I am aware that this is a statement with significant competition. I would go to the flat ground at dusk, carrying the stake, and make a mark. Something geometric. A circle, a triangle, a spiral, the beginning of a sequence of numbers scratched in crude numerals. Then I would leave and return the following morning. The formation that had appeared in the barley overnight would be a response. Sometimes a direct elaboration of what I had drawn. Sometimes a correction. Sometimes an extension that took my crude mark and continued it in a direction I had not anticipated. And that, when I understood the mathematics of it, was always exactly right. It was always more precise than what I had offered. And it was always more sophisticated. And it always contained more information than I had given. But it always began from what I had given. It took my starting point, however rough, and worked forward from there. By the third week, I had moved from simple shapes into mathematical constants. I would scratch the first 4 digits of a known sequence in the dirt, the Fibonacci numbers, the first several digits of pi, the beginning of the sequence of prime numbers, and the response would extend the sequence further than I would have been able to carry it by memory alone, and then add a structure I didn't recognize attached to the sequence's end. I would photograph the formation, study the attached structure, identify it over the following hours. Sometimes this took the whole day. Sometimes I needed to call the Bristol colleague who thought I was working on a data compression problem. And then I would scratch a crude version of the new structure back into the dirt, showing that I had understood it. The next response would elaborate, correct, extend. We were building a shared vocabulary out of mathematics, which is the only language that does not require a common evolutionary history to be mutually legible. Two minds that have never met and share no spoken language can still agree that the ratio of a circle's circumference to its diameter is what it is. That is as close to a universal as anything in the universe comes. I was sleeping 2 or 3 hours a night by the 5th week. I had lost several kilograms and my knuckles were split from the cold of early morning fieldwork. I had told no one what was happening. My sister had called twice and I had not called back. I had answered 3 emails from the Bristol colleague, and each answer was shorter than the last, deflecting the increasingly pointed questions about what I was actually working on. I was afraid of what would happen if the conversation became known before I understood where it was going. I had 9 years of experience watching what happened when genuine anomalous activity became public. The best outcome was that it was absorbed into the existing discourse of believers and skeptics, and became another data point in a field already saturated with contested claims. The worst outcome, and I had seen versions of this twice in my years in Wiltshire, was institutional intervention. I had met the government liaison officers. They were not stupid men. They were not cruel men. They were men whose job was to identify information that might cause public disruption and to manage its circulation. And they were good at their jobs. I had no reason to think that the conversation I had started would survive contact with their institutional mandate intact. So I kept the records, kept the exchange logs. Photographs of each mark I had made in the dirt, dated and timed, matched chronologically with the formation that had responded. And I kept working alone. It was in the 6th week that their car appeared at the end of the lane. I had known the government team was active in their area. I had seen their vehicles, unmarked but recognizable to anyone who had spent enough time in these fields to know the difference between a tourist's hire car and a surveillance vehicle with a very sophisticated antenna array. I had seen a drone overhead once at a height that told me it was photographing specific formations rather than surveying the area generally. I had seen, from a distance, a man in civilian clothes speaking with a farmer on the Pewsey Vale Road and showing him something on a tablet, and the farmer's expression had been the particular one I had learned to read over 9 years of interviews. The expression of a person being told to say nothing to anyone about something that has already happened on his land. They came to my cottage on a Wednesday evening, 2 of them. One was a man in his 50s, heavy-set, with the particular physical stillness of someone who has spent a career in rooms where the information flow was asymmetric. He moved slowly and he spoke slowly, and every word he chose was a choice. The other was a woman in her 30s, who said nothing during the cottage visit but who watched me with a focused intelligence that I found, honestly, more alarming than the man's practiced authority showed me. Credentials. They asked if I would be willing to share my research records in the interest of national security. They did not explain why my records of crop measurements constituted a national security concern, but they did not need to. What they were actually saying was, "We know what you have been doing, and we are now the people deciding what happens next." I told them I would consider it. They gave me a card. They left. I sat in the kitchen for an hour, and then I drove to the field. What I scratched in the dirt that night was not mathematics. I had been thinking for several days about the limits of the conversation I was having. Mathematics is a clean language, precise, unambiguous, immune to the kind of emotional noise that distorts human communication. I was grateful for it. It had given us a shared foundation in weeks that would have taken human linguists years to establish with any other species. But there are things that mathematics does not easily say. Quantity, relationship, structure, yes. Mathematics says these things beautifully. Loss. The specific texture of being a creature that knows it will die and keeps working anyway. This is not a sequence of prime numbers. It is not a geometric ratio. It is not a mathematical constant. I knelt on the flat ground at the field's edge in the dark, with the chalk plane extending out in every direction under a clear sky. And I drew slowly and badly, the best approximation I could manage of a human figure. Not a geometric representation, a drawing the kind a child makes. A vertical line for the body, horizontal lines for the arms, a circle for the head. Then beside it, smaller by about a third, another figure. The same crude anatomy, a child. Then below the smaller figure, a horizontal line. The symbol we use across cultures, across languages, across recorded human history. The body at rest, the person gone. I do not entirely know why I drew that. I had not lost a child. I was not thinking, consciously, of anyone specific. Though there are people I have lost, and there was a period in my 40s when the losses came in a cluster that I think, in retrospect, shaped the particular way I approached the fieldwork. The solitary nature of it, the obsessive precision, the refusal to let the data go unrecorded, regardless of the personal cost of staying. But I was not thinking about any of that deliberately as I drew. I was tired, and I was frightened, and I was sitting in the dark on the chalk plain with the government team's card in my pocket, and the stars overhead, and the enormous fact of the conversation I had been having pressing on me from every direction, and what I wanted to communicate. More than any mathematical constant, more than any sequence or ratio or geometric structure, was simply, this is what we are. We are the creatures who lose the people we love. We know it will happen before it happens, and we carry that knowledge every day, and we keep going anyway. We build monuments on chalk hills, and we measure them 5,000 years later, and we still do not know why they were built, but we feel when we stand inside them that they matter to the people who built them. We make marks in fields in the dark because we cannot stop making marks. We reach toward whatever is listening because reaching is what we do. That is the central fact of human life. More than our mathematics, more than our ingenuity, more than our persistence, it is this, carrying of it, and the continuing. I smoothed the drawing out afterward. I drove back to the cottage. I slept until daylight, which was more than I had managed in a week. When I arrived at the field at first light, the barley was standing and flat and completely undisturbed. No formation. Not in the field I had been working in. Not in any of the fields I could see from the lane. The chalk plain stretched out empty and golden in the early light, and there was nothing new in it. I walked the perimeter of the field. I checked the flat ground where I had drawn. My scratches were still there. The drawing remained undisturbed, in the dirt. I stood at the field's edge for a long time. I did not know what to make of the absence. The most obvious interpretation was that I had broken the channel in some way, drawn something that the intelligence on the other side of the conversation could not parse, or did not want to respond to, or that had read as noise rather than signal. The second interpretation was that something had simply changed in the tempo of the exchange, that the response was coming but was not ready. I held both interpretations and tried not to prefer either, which is easier to say than to do. The man from the government team was parked at the top of the lane. He got out when he saw me, and he walked down toward me at an unhurried pace, and he was carrying 2 cups of coffee, which I did not expect. He held one out to me. I took it. It was still warm. Stood at the field's edge and drank our coffee, and neither of us spoke for a while. The morning was doing what August mornings do in this part of the world. The sky going from gray to pale blue in increments, the barley catching the first direct light and going from colorless to gold, Silbury Hill visible on the horizon to the south, the mound's perfect geometry unchanged by 5,000 years of weather and human attention, and the accumulated weight of every question anyone had ever asked about it. "Nothing this morning," he said. "No," I said. After another moment, he said carefully, "What did you put in the dirt last night?" I told him. I described what I had drawn. I told him why, as much as I understood why. He listened without interrupting. When I'd finished, he was quiet for a longer moment than the preceding ones. "When did you last sleep properly?" he said. "Yesterday," I said. 4 hours. He nodded. He didn't say anything else. We finished the coffee. He collected both cups. He went back to his car, and he sat in it, and his partner got out and walked to the field's edge herself, and stood looking at the empty barley, and I sat on the stone wall and watched the morning continue to arrive. And I tried not to calculate the probability that I had ended something I would never fully understand. Formation came down at noon. Full bright August noon, clear sky, no cloud, the sun directly overhead. I was still there, sitting on the wall, because I could not think of anywhere else to be. The man was still in his car at the top of the lane, which told me something about how they operated. They were patient men, patient enough to wait for whatever I was waiting for, without knowing what that was. His partner had gone somewhere an hour earlier. I heard the compression sound before I saw anything move. That low resonance, that pressure felt in the chest before the ears. And then the barley began to fall, and I watched it. It took 12 minutes. It was the largest formation I had ever documented. Later survey work would put the total area at just over 4 acres, making it one of the largest formations in the recorded history of the phenomenon. Base geometry, as far as I could determine from the ground, was a circle. Inside the circle there was something I had never seen in any formation. I had measured in 9 years of field work. There was a figure. Not a geometric figure, a drawn figure. Clumsy, imprecise in the way that all representational images in an unfamiliar medium are imprecise. The kind of imprecision that comes not from lack of intelligence, but from lack of practice. From trying for the first time to make something that is not geometric, not abstract, not mathematical. A figure made of standing and laid crop, rendered with a resolution that I would spend 3 days measuring, and that would in the end reduce me to sitting in the middle of the formation, with my measuring equipment in my lap, and my eyes closed, trying to find a scale for what I was looking at. A human figure, standing. Beside it, smaller another figure. Below the smaller figure, a horizontal line. Exactly the symbols I had drawn. Taken up, received, and returned. And above the human figure, not below it, not beside it, placed at the apex of the composition with the same deliberateness that governed every element of every formation I had ever documented. A single circle. Small, precisely made, separate from the base geometry of the formation. Not a structural element. An addition. Something placed there because it needed to be there. Because the response was incomplete without it. I have been very careful in every professional context about how I describe my interpretation of that circle. I know that projecting human symbolic meaning onto alien geometry is methodologically problematic. I know that the history of this field is littered with people who saw what they needed to see in the formations rather than what was actually there, and that the damage this tendency has done to the credibility of the genuine research has been substantial and lasting. I know all of this, and I still think I know what the circle meant. I think it meant, not gone, different place. I think it was the kindest thing I have ever been told by anyone or anything, and I think it was told to me imperfectly and haltingly and with obvious effort by something that had never tried to draw a representational figure before in its life. And I think the effort itself was part of the message. They had received what I sent. Not the mathematics, not the geometry, the other thing. The thing underneath all of it, that the mathematics and the geometry had only been able to point at sideways. And they had answered it in the only way available to them in this medium. Constructing a representational image for the first time, making something clumsy and unmistakable and true. The precision of the geometric language they normally used was not available for this. This required a different kind of making. They made it anyway. The man from the car was standing beside me by the time the formation completed. He had come down the lane at some point in the 12 minutes, and I had not noticed him arriving. He stood and looked at the formation for a long time. Then he looked at me. "You knew what to say," he said. "I knew what to send," I said. "Don't know if they understood it the way I meant it." He looked at the circle above the figure. "Do you think that is an answer?" I said. He was not a man who expressed things easily. Professional economy of his usual expression was real, not performed. But there was something in his face, standing there at the edge of that field, at noon on an August day, that was not professional. It was just a man looking at something that had never happened before and trying to find the proportions for it. "Going to want to talk to you," he said. "Properly, at length." "I know," I said. "I'll come in. I need a day." He thought about this. Then he nodded, and he walked back up the lane, and I heard his car start and drive away. And then there was nothing but the sound of the wind in the barley that was still standing outside the formation, and the distant traffic on the road to the west. I spent that day in the field, not measuring, not photographing. I had the equipment with me, and I did not use it. I sat at the boundary of the formation, where the laid crop met the standing crop, and I thought about the database, and about what the database did not contain. I thought about the old woman in Marlborough who had said the circles were old, and the people asking were new. I thought about the farmers who had told me reluctantly, and with visible discomfort, about the sound and the light and the particular motion of their crops going down. I thought about the progression in the records. Simple to complex, circle to pictogram to fractal, to constant to the structures that had no name yet. And I thought about what it would take to have been watching us long enough to know where we put our monuments, to have learned to mark the fields near our oldest deliberate structures, to have developed a geometrical language complex enough to encode the Mandelbrot set in agricultural crop, and then waited, patience that makes our entire recorded history look like a brief experiment. For someone to understand that the language was a language. The formations cluster at Avebury and Silbury Hill, and the West Kennet, Long Barrow, not because of the electromagnetic properties of the chalk, which was my hypothesis in 2020, and which I now believe was wrong in its mechanism, if not entirely wrong in its observation. They cluster there, because whatever made them has been watching us since before those structures were built. They watched us raise Silbury Hill across generations, revising and extending it, the successive phases of construction visible now only in the stratigraphic record beneath the mound. They watched us arrange the megaliths at Avebury in a circle large enough to contain a village. And they watched us build a village in it centuries later. And they watched us study it centuries after that, without being able to fully explain it. They watched us build Stonehenge in stages, across centuries, adding the trilithons and the bluestones from Wales, and the precision of the solstice alignments, each generation inheriting and extending what the last had left. And I wonder whether any of this was familiar to what was watching. Whether the practice of beginning with a simple mark and extending it, revising it, making it more precise across successive iterations, resembled something they recognized. We had been doing in stone what they had been doing in crop. We had been leaving marks in our fields to show that we were here, and that we were thinking, and that we would be back. The difference is that their timescale is not ours. Their patience is not impatience suppressed. It is something else, something that operates at a scale that makes our concept of waiting meaningless. They do not experience the decades as long. The whole of our documented history is not, in whatever experience they have of duration, a particularly long time. And yet, this is the part that I return to the most, the part I find most humbling, most difficult to hold. They noticed the man in the field with the stick. Out of everything that has happened in these fields over the decades, they noticed the crude circle scratched in the dirt by a tired, dirty, frightened human being who had finally decided, after 9 years of collecting their messages, to try sending one back. They noticed, and they adapted, and they drew back. And when the drawing changed, when the mark I made stopped being geometric and became something else, something personal, something that was less about mathematical precision than about the specific weight of being human, they changed too. They tried something new. They drew something clumsy and unmistakable and true. I went in for the briefing the following day. Brought everything. The 6,241 records, the exchange logs, the geometric analyses, the seed germination data from Exeter, the magnetometer readings from the night the formation came down around me. I put it all on the table in a government building that I will not describe beyond saying it had the particular institutional smell of carpet that has been cleaned too many times and air conditioning that was set 3 degrees too cold. And I said, this is what happened, and this is what I did, and this is what they said back. Take all of it. You cannot carry this forward without all of it, and it needs to be carried forward by more people than one man with a stick. There were 6 people in the room. The heavy-set man from the cottage visit, his partner, a man who said he was from a university department that he named, in a way that made clear the name was a covering description rather than a precise institutional affiliation, a woman from what she called a signals analysis background, which I took to mean electronic intelligence, who spent the first 20 minutes of the briefing paging through the exchange logs with an expression I could not read. A younger man who appeared to be taking notes, but whose questions, when they came, were not a note-taker's questions. And, in the corner, mostly silent, a man in his late 60s, who had been in Wiltshire in the late 1980s during the period when the formations had first begun to draw serious attention, who had written a classified internal assessment in 1991 that apparently reached conclusions not entirely unlike mine, and who had spent 30 years watching those conclusions, gathered dust in a filing system that nobody with authority had chosen to open. He sat with his hands folded on the table, and he did not say much, but when he did speak, the room went quiet in a way that told me the others knew the weight of the 30 years. The woman who had said nothing during the cottage visit, the one who had watched me with the focused intelligence that had alarmed me more than anything the man had said, spoke first and most extensively. She had been an astrophysicist at Cambridge before the agency recruited her, and she had been tracking the anomalous formations independently since 2017, building a database that overlapped with mine by about 40%, and that was, in several respects, more rigorous than mine in its treatment of the physical evidence, the stem samples, the soil magnetic particles, the germination rate data, all of which she had been processing through a more sophisticated, analytical pipeline than the Exeter laboratory I'd been using. She had reached the conclusion that the formations were communications approximately 6 months before I had scratched the first circle in the dirt. The reason she had not begun the exchange experiments herself was that she had been waiting for authorization, and authorization had not come. The internal process required a review committee. The review committee required a quorum. The quorum required attendance from several individuals who had scheduling conflicts that had persisted across 3 consecutive quarters. She had been waiting with the patience of someone who believes in the process and is watching the process fail, with no mechanism available to her to accelerate it. And she had been watching the summer's formation activity with an increasing urgency that she had communicated upward through several memoranda that had not produced the required quorum. She looked at my exchange logs for a long time, not the geometric analyses. Those she went through quickly, with the assurance of someone who already understood what they said. What she spent time on were the photographs of my marks in the dirt, crude circles, the scratched numerals, the imperfect spirals. She looked at each one, and then at the formation photograph that followed it. And she did this in silence for the better part of 15 minutes, while the rest of the room waited. Then she looked at me. "What made you draw the figures?" she said. "The human and the child." I told her what I've told you. I didn't entirely know. Tired and frightened, and it was what came. She nodded. A long pause, then. It was the right thing to send. It wouldn't have occurred to me. She paused again. I was trying to stay in their language the whole time. Mathematics. Geometry. I thought that was the bridge. I was thinking about it as a code-breaking problem. Find the shared grammar. Demonstrate comprehension. Build vocabulary from there. I was wrong about where the bridge needed to go. The man in the corner with the folded hands looked up. He said quietly, to no one in particular. "We argued about that in 1991. He said it the way a man says something he has thought about for 30 years, and has mostly stopped expecting anyone to hear. Then he went back to his folded hands. She was not wrong about the bridge. The mathematics had been essential. I want to be clear about that, because in the years since there has been a tendency among some people who know the story to romanticize the human and child drawing, as though it was sufficient on its own, as though any expression of human emotion sent into a barley field would have produced the same result. It would not have. Without the 7 weeks of geometric exchange, there would have been no established channel, no demonstrated mutual recognition, no context within which the figures in the dirt could land as something other than noise. The mathematics was the shared alphabet. It made the sentence possible. She was right that the alphabet alone would not have been enough. The mathematics had opened a channel. The figures had been the first thing sent through it that was not geometry. First thing that was, in the most basic sense, a self. The conversation has continued since then. I can say that much without violating anything I have agreed to. What I cannot say, not because of institutional constraint alone, but because we genuinely do not yet have adequate language for much of it, is what has been transmitted. We have mathematicians and geometers, and physicists, and linguists working on the decipherment. The astrophysicist from the briefing is leading a team of 11 people, and she has brought in 2 specialists from outside the country whose expertise in certain areas of topology has proven necessary for understanding structures in the more recent formations that nobody in the original team could classify. The work is slow. The formations continue to appear, and they continue to grow in complexity. And there are formations in the past 2 years that our best people classify as depicting geometric structures that should not be possible within our current mathematical framework. Either evidence of a gap in our theory that we had not previously recognized, or evidence of a mathematical framework we are only beginning to be introduced to, or, most likely, both simultaneously. The gap and the framework are probably the same things from different sides. I still go to the fields. I still measure. The smell is still green and slightly sweet. The ordinary smell of broken stems in summer. The smell that was there the first night and that will, I expect, be there in every formation that comes after this. The mornings are still the way Wiltshire mornings are, pale and quiet and very clear. The sky that particular washed-out blue that has no drama in it, just light and space, and the gentle geometry of chalk hills in every direction. I think about the old woman near Marlborough. I think she was speaking a truth she couldn't fully articulate. And I'm not certain I can articulate it now. The circles are old. We are new. In the timeline that matters for this particular contact, we are very, very new. We have been leaving marks for an eye blink of geological time. And we spent most of that eye blink debating what the other marks meant, rather than looking for whoever was leaving them. The thing that matters, the thing I have come to believe, is the specifically human contribution to this. Not our greatest mathematics, not our most sophisticated geometry, though these were necessary, and I do not diminish them, is simpler than any of that. We say what we've lost. We reach toward whatever is listening when we are at our most diminished, at our most tired, in the dark, with a stick in our hand, and nothing but the stars overhead. We make the mark anyway, we keep looking. That is what we sent. That is what was received. That is what, I believe, nature of the conversation from transmission to exchange. The morning after the noon formation, the day before the briefing, I went back to the field before sunrise and stood at the edge in the dark, with the dew coming in off the plain and the Milky Way still visible above the eastern hill. I stood there until the light came, and when the formation emerged from the darkness in the growing gray of the morning, 4 acres of perfect geometry, cradling a clumsy drawing of a human figure and a child, and a small circle placed above them with the patient, imprecise care of something that had never tried this before. I was very quiet for a long time. Then I drove back to the cottage and called my sister back. That seemed like the right place to start.